Hi, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are around the world. My name is Karen A., and this is the Afro-Euro Reco12 podcast. Reco12 is a family of recovery resources to help those suffering from all addictions and all afflictions. So whether you're an alcoholic, a drug addict, an anorexic, a bulimic, a workaholic, a hoarder, a gambler, a slaw, a validation addict, and you're free to add anything to the list. We hope that you will hear something here and identify with a fellow who has traveled your path and found recovery through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and working the 12 steps, one day at a time. Here with me today is Richard S. Richard S. will be sharing his journey through multiple addictions, multiple afflictions, into recovery, and how he is living today happy, joyous, and free as a result of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. If you would like to hear some of our podcasts, you could go to reco12.com. And if you'd like to share, we are looking for more speakers. I will put my number in the chat. Please reach out to me or reach out to Justin, the founder of Reco12, and let us know, because we need more people, more fellowships, more miracles. Would you like to contribute a seventh tradition? You could do so at reco12.com/support, and we accept PayPal and Venmo. Without further ado, it is my honor to have our fellow Richard S. share his experience, strength, and hope today. Welcome, Richard.
Good day. Nice to be here. Thanks for having a meeting for me to attend and for participating in my recovery. I'm Richard S. I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'm continually amazed at this fellowship that we're part of. I'm rather pedantic, and I did some statistics at one point, and I worked out that every given second, 24/7, there are about 15,000 people in 12-step meetings around the world at least. So we are not alone at any point in the day. And that for me is part of just one of many miracles. I had quite an adventuresome journey. My spiritual quest ran alongside my addiction phase, my addiction. I'm at a loss for words, but when I was preteen, I used to sneak sips of a liqueur that belonged to my mother, and even at that age, I pretty quickly learned to top up the bottles with water, which was a very early indication of my proneness to addictive behavior, and that sort of continued more or less. I was a very observant Christian at the time, and then when I got into the first year of high school, there was a diametric change, and I started to experiment with weed, and I sort of looked down on the drunks because of the way they stumbled around and lost control, so to speak. But then it was about 3 years later that I was drinking to put an edge on the weed, and all the tables had turned. And by the time I was in the last year of high school, I was, to all intents and purposes, a full-blown alcoholic, and to some extent an addict, and pretty much doing maintenance drinking throughout the school day. I'd left home at the age of 16, moved into a hippie commune. I'd sold weed to sustain myself, and then I went into university. I spent 4 years at university, where I grew up on the coast, and I pretty much majored in surfing and chess and backgammon. And after that, I was conscripted into the military, and I did combat for 18 months in Angola, which is we had a border war with Angola, which is immediately to the northwest of us. And after that, I went into corporate. I started to work for a major breweries. And at that stage, it was quite acceptable and quite almost fashionable to have champagne breakfasts, product launches, business lunches. And to drink was pretty much acceptable. And so I was doing that, and I was adding to the whole bouquet of drugs that I was on. My spiritual journey had faltered in the first year of high school as well, and I'd begun to question things outside of Christianity. And so in the course of the next 10 years, I went through just about every sort of established ideology, if you like, the South American Aztecs and Incas, the North American, Native American belief systems, the European ones, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the pagan Middle Ages religion, Islam, both Buddhisms, Hinduism, and at some point, and obviously also the African traditional religions. And at some point, it got really crazy for me. I'd filled my head with too many ideas and too many diverse and contradictory conceptualizations. And I found myself on a very steep hill in a place called Port Elizabeth, which is on the south coast of South Africa. And the British had settled there in 1820, and there was this very steep hill with an ancient graveyard on it. And I was sitting on a pentagon with these, so to speak, so-called Satanists, devil worshippers, and there were the black candles and the blackened skulls and the whole tableau. And I looked at myself and I thought, just to what extent had I arrived? Had I arrived? And it was like a surrealist sort of parody, and it was almost a black comedy for me, the point that I had reached. And this pretty much coincided with my first years in the corporate workforce. And for the next 10 years, it was party time, my 20s. And I'm going to cut this a bit short because however spectacular it might have been, I want to try and keep this down to the relevant facts. And at the age of 29, and I've seen this as a pattern in the 12-step rooms, at the age of 29, people seem to shift gear, seem to sort of go next level, look upon themselves as it's no longer an excuse to be rampant and irresponsible in your 20s, and you're 29, you're going into 30, and you better start making some responsible decisions. And so I met this lady, and in 6 short months, I'd asked her to marry her, and it was a classic addict decision, because I asked her to marry her because all my friends thought she was nice. She was a prospect. I don't think even at that stage I thought she was particularly suited to me as a marriage partner. But regardless, we got married. My now ex-wife discovered that the Catholic Church demands 6 months of marriage lessons, so to speak, and she wasn't prepared to wait. So we got married in a court of law between Christmas and New Year. And at that stage, I went to my father-in-law to be, and I said, "Look, I've got to get this drinking under control, and I hear that you're in Alcoholics Anonymous, so I'm hoping you can do something to help me." And he said, sure. And in those days, what a 12-step meant was you went to a person's house, you talked them off of a spree, and you took them to meetings for a couple of times. And that was pretty much the way a 12-step was done. It was practical. You bought them a big book and took them to a few meetings. And that was it. The 12 steps says we tried to carry the message. It doesn't say that we were 100% successful. It says we tried because of the nature of alcoholism and addiction. We're going to balk and push back against any concerted instruction. So it's very much a guiding force that we become. And that's what happened. I was taken to a couple of meetings. And at that stage, I was cynical and resentful, as a lot of us are, about the idea of God. And I think a lot of us come into the rooms and we're resentful at God because He hasn't answered our prayers. And look at the state He's let us get into. And I went to a meeting, and there was a woman who I found out later was quite an icon in local Alcoholics Anonymous, and there was a radio personality, and they spoke. There were two speakers at the meeting. It was a standard AA meeting, and I looked around and I thought, well, these people are speaking sense, speaking well. I looked at the posters on the wall, let go and let God, just for today, one day at a time, all of those, as we've all seen. And I thought it was quite...
Got questions about addiction, recovery, or just life in general? Let's noodle it out together. Grab your big book, a pen, a highlighter, and a notepad, and join Nikki M and me, Justin B, on Reco12 Noodle It Out with Nikki M. Each episode, we take real-life questions, ours, yours, and those from the recovery community, and dig deep into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous to find real, practical solutions. So, if you're ready to do the work and apply the solution, tune in to Noodle It Out with Nikki M, streaming now on your favorite podcast platform.
Quite cheesy, but there were no dents on the cars in the parking lot. People seemed to be dressed reasonably well, and something seemed to be working. And an egotistical, like me, I stood back and I thought, well, I can do this on my own. And then when all these men stood up and held hands and said the Serenity Prayer, I was out of there like a shot, because this was way too naff for me. And so the strongest part of my message is that for the next 6-7 years, I dry drunked it, I white-knuckled it, I didn't drink, but I didn't get better. I abstained, I didn't get sober. I was drunk without the alcohol. I was stoned without the drugs. I was resentful, I was fearful, I was mean, I was nasty. I was an ultimately horrible person. And as I said, that took me 7 years, and in that stage, I had a spiritual crisis. I think what a spiritual rock bottom. And I sat down and I decided, okay, I'm going to reduce my religion to all the ideas that I know to be sure, to be absolute fact. And I'm going to restrict this to a page and a half for foolscap. And so all that I knew for sure is that there's matter and space and time. I contradicted Einstein in the process. And that the whole thing was bound together by energy, so God must be energy, and that was as profound as I got. And as like any good pseudo-philosopher, I needed a diagram for my philosophy, so I drew a circle, I drew a triangle, and I named the sides matter, space, and time, and then I drew an all-encompassing circle, and I called the circle energy, and there was my universe wrapped up in a circle, and nothing changed, nothing got better. And so at the end of 7 years, I had a very unspectacular rock bottom relapse. I turned off the highway after seeing a billboard advert for cider. Cider wasn't something that had been around when I was drinking much. I turned off and I went to a pub and I had a couple of ciders, and for 2 weeks I would basically go and sit drop my little girl off at preschool, and I'd go and sit in a church, an Anglican church up the road from me. We could go into them at any time of the day. In those days, it was before they were stealing the candlesticks out of them, out of churches. And I'd sit in the dark in the creaking church with a 6-pack of cider and beg God for change, for help. And I sort of gone full circle back to my traditional God. And at the end of that 2-week binge, so to speak, I went back to my father-in-law and I said, I think I better take this seriously. And what was key to that was that I was hopeless. I had absolutely no hope left in me. I had tried everything, the self-help, the gurus, the peer support, the aligned religious recovery philosophies. And he said, fine, have you still got the big book I gave you? And I said, well, no, I traded that in at the second-hand bookstore. But it's sort of like carrying the message, don't you think? But he wasn't buying that, and he took me to another meeting. This was 7 years later. In Johannesburg at the time, we had about 120 AA meetings a week, and he took me to a meeting in a different area on a Saturday night. And the format was to have an opening and a closing speaker. And the opening and closing speakers were exactly the same two people that I'd seen 7 years earlier at my first meeting. And it was like God smacked me on the back of the head and said, listen, you didn't listen to me the first time. Here's the message again. And I listened. And at that stage, if they'd told me to put on a kaftan and go and stand in the street with a tambourine and beg for money for them, I would have done it, because something seemed to be working and I had nothing. I had no options, no alternatives. So I started, that was 28 years ago, and it's been mind-blowing. You know, when we go into the room, so all we want to do is stop drinking, and we want to feel better, and we hope to get a window in which to sort out the chaos of our lives. But recovery in the 12-step program is so much more, and so much more, in fact, that it's very difficult to tell the newcomer just what he's in for, what he or her, or they are in for. And I think it's because we can't put it into words. You know, when they ask us to share, they say, our stories disclose in a general way our experience, strength, and hope. And mostly when you hear these stories, about 70% of it is experience, and about 4% of it is what changed, and then the balance, about 20% of it, is what we are like now, and that's because we can't find the words. I think in terms of the 12 steps, my first time round, I had battled to find a sponsor. And eventually I found a brother in the Catholic Church. And it still took me about 3 years to do the 12 steps. And I think the big lesson I learned from that, and the lesson I hope to impart, is that as addicts, we have a propensity to need something to be complicated. Something doesn't have authenticity or integrity unless it's very complicated. If it's simple, it's something to be suspicious about. And so it took me ages. When I did my fourth step, I opened up an Excel spreadsheet. I listed everybody I knew. I then started to examine defects, and then I not content with the dictionary, I then went to the thesaurus. I found out that some positive things done to excess become defects, so it's not all roses on the obverse side. And I made this spreadsheet interactive. I couldn't remember much because the drugs and alcohol had really affected my short-term and long-term memory. So I did an historical timeline and tried to tie everything down right from my first memories at the age of 2.5 right through to the present time. Every single person, every single defect I could think of. And I sabotaged myself in the process because I could never finish it. So I stalled on the fourth step, and people do sabotage themselves in that respect, and it's because they do it with a mind to the fifth step and the ninth step. They do it with the mind that they're doing their fourth step, and at some stage they're going to have to tell somebody this, and they're going to have to make it right, and that interferes with the train of thought that makes a fourth step effective and thorough. And so what I've learned from that whole long, circuitous, years-long journey is that it's simple. And then when it says, admitted we were powerless, it means just that. When it says our lives become unmanageable, and that if we move over into the co-pilot seat, there's just might be a chance that we could make progress in this thing. If we applied to a higher power, as long as it's anything but us, we could make a decision in the third step to do the balance of the next steps up to step 9. And if we could do a self-analysis, all of this is very simple. I've described the steps as they do in chapter 5. You can read the 12 steps in 15 minutes, and I'm not sure it takes much longer than that. When people go to a step meeting and spend an hour and a half debating a particular step, I can't find much more to say about it after the first 20 or 40 minutes, because it really isn't that complicated. For me, my life is unmanageable because I have no control, and that's as much as I need to understand what's going on with me. And then I got involved with the American. I don't know what to call it. It's like it's a collectivity of people called the Fellowship of the Spirit, which runs alongside AA as a spiritual take on the recovery program in the 12 steps. And we did a South African Fellowship of the we did a couple actually Fellowship of the Spirit conferences. We hooked up via, at that stage it was Skype, before Zoom, and we invited Americans to share with us at our conference, and in that way we were pretty much here in South Africa way ahead of our time, because Zoom and these kind of meetings are pretty much commonplace now. And one of the conferences that we did, we examined how Bill Wilson turned the 6 concepts of the Oxford group, the first century Christian fellowship, as it was called, into 12 steps. And Bill Wilson's clip answer to that is that he wanted to close the loopholes that he knew that the alcoholics would find. But on closer analysis, I found that, and this is a very personal take, my opinion, and you guys know by now that you can take it or leave it, is that there still are 6 steps. When Bill Wilson, when he got to the chapter 5, he was sort of brought to task by the fellowship at the time for being too dictatorial and too rigid and authoritarian in his approach in the first 4 chapters, and they asked him to tone it down, and he agreed, but it took him probably a chapter or less than that to get back up to full steam. But he sat down at 12 steps at chapter 5, writing the book, and he was trying to condense the way that they were doing things down to a sort of a successive program of events, and so the 12 steps were born. Lois concurs that Bill Wilson had one of what he calls his phantom ulcer attacks, and he wasn't feeling, as he says, he wasn't feeling particularly spiritual, and he wrote down and he dashed the 12 steps off in 20 odd minutes. And that for me is a miracle, because I've pretty much examined the big book back to front, and I can fault it in a lot of places. We can have hour-long meetings about aspects of the big book. But the 12 steps are perfect and they're faultless. And for me personally, they cannot be questioned, they cannot be corrected, and they don't need to be. But at the conference, I discovered that the reason why there was 6 extra steps is because we needed willingness as addicts and alcoholics with a particular psychic profile. We needed to be willing before we could do each step. So for me, there's basically 7 steps. There's the first step, which is a standalone, and it's a statement of intent. And then the second and third steps for me are the God steps. There's the considering the possibility that there might be something other than myself that's good enough. And then the third step is deciding to make a decision to allocate management of our unmanageability over to a power other than ourselves. And then there's the fourth step, which is introspection and self-examination. That means nothing unless you can actually hear yourself say it. And I believe I come into contact with my higher power when I speak to when I do a fifth step. On the one hand, I have a sponsee will come to me and he'll say, "Oh, I don't need to tell somebody because I don't need to tell God in the fifth step because He knows everything I do." But we suppress the God within and we hide the stuff we do out of shame and regret and guilt. And so there's a whole layer of us that the God within isn't aware of, and he let's call it, won't call God it. It only hears it when we talk, when we enunciate it, when we talk to it. And when we talk out verbally, we try to talk accurately and with good grammar and concisely and effective communication. And that's the first time we hear about what we actually are, is when we listen to ourselves. And it's at that point that the God within hears me. And that's, my experience has been that I've done a lot of fifth steps for people. And 20 minutes later, I can't remember a single thing of what they've said. It's uncanny. I did a first step with a guy in a rehab, and he did something so particularly addict. And I said, I'd like you, with your permission, to use this anonymously as an example when I go to meetings. And he said, fine. And I was just literally 20 minutes down the road, and I couldn't remember what it was, still to this day. And that's the way, we're just sounding boards when people do their first step with us. And so the fourth and fifth step go together. The sixth step is willingness to attend to our defects. And again, in terms of the third step, to hand it over, to turn it over, not hand it over. I must be explicit about that. We don't hand things over. We retain our chaos, but we turn it over to God's management. So the fifth, sixth, and seventh step go together. We get willing to attend to our defects, and in 7 we do our defects. In 8 we get willing to do our amends, and in 9 we do our amends. And then we have what I call the routine steps. I don't call them the maintenance steps because I don't want to maintain this. I want to grow it. So I have a daily routine, what I call the lifestyle steps. That's 10 and 9 and 10. 10 and 11, and that's. Continue to take personal inventory, which is basically the steps from 4 up to 9. And when I'm wrong, promptly admit it. And then 11 is to grow my conscious contact, my relationship with my higher power. And then we get to 12, and 12 says, having had a spiritual awakening. And that's a reference right back to step 3, to the decision we took to get tight with our higher power and to practice the 12 steps and to do the program and to recover. And for me, recovery is getting back the stuff that happened to me before I went to high school, the sense of moral and ethical commitment that I had, the sense of purity and hope and optimism that I had before I went to high school and smoked that first joint and started to question everything proceed to screw everything up. And So when I got to the 12th step, it said, having had a spiritual awakening. I had an awakening. There's an appendix in the big book that tells the difference between a spiritual experience like Paul Wilson had in his white light experience in Towns Hospital. And that's spiritual experience. I've had a couple of those, but they're not as hard wired in my memory as my spiritual experiences. My spiritual awakening has been, and an awakening is usually, takes a bit of time. It's like came to believe. We didn't have a light bulb moment. We grudgingly gave way to the fact that maybe we weren't at the center of the universe. We admitted we were powerless. That's also not a flash of inspiration. It means that we finally given way and owned up to our powerlessness and our unmanageability. And I just want to make a point here that the words admitted, it's got two dimensions of meaning, and the first one is to own up. As we know, we finally admitted all this about ourselves. But the other meaning is to let in, to allow in. I like to get admitted to rehab, or you used to get movie tickets that would say admit one on them. And so I believe that the solution to serial relapse is we're quite happy to go to meetings and own up and admit, but are we ready to admit our diagnosis? Are we ready to allow our alcoholism and its stigma and guilt and remorse and resentment in and own it? And I think if we do, then we're on the road to a pretty sound recovery. And then we look at the 12th step, and it says we tried to, as I've referred to before, we tried to carry the message to a still suffering alcoholic. My favorite line of all in the big book runs something like, our real purpose as opposed to our primary purpose, which is to carry the message and the tradition that goes along with it, is a line that says our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and others, and that's my lifestyle. That is my step 10 and 11, is fitting myself to be of maximum service to my higher power and those about us, and doesn't specify addicts and alcoholics. It's anyone. And so my default response in any situation is to be of service to people. And that's where I find myself now. And it was at another fellowship of the Spirit Conference on a Skype address from I don't know, one of the states in America. And the speaker addressed the 12th step, and he spent a lot of time talking about his work in prisons. And when it came time for the question, I asked him something that I'd been preoccupied with, and this was, where does practicing these principles in all our affairs, where does that fit in? For me, it had been, I'd done the first round of 12 steps for my addiction and my substance and my obsession. And then when I got to the 12 steps, I could apply it to the 12th step. I would go back to the beginning in the first step, and I would then apply it to all other areas of my life. And, for me, inside an enclave like this, I am wholeheartedly an addict, an alcoholic. I'm dual diagnosis. But out there in the real life, my alcoholism is just a slice in my pizza. My addiction is a slice in my pizza. My dual diagnosis, my psychiatric diagnoses, or a slice, in a pizza that that also has slices of family, of recreation, of spirituality, of employment, of avocation, as the big book states, which would be your vocation that is secondary to your primary vocation, which in my instance is the 12-step program. And the speaker in turn came back to me and he says, well, when I practice these principles in all my affairs, I do it in terms of the traditions. And that was a light bulb moment for me. And then shortly after that, somebody sent me a document that was compiled by somebody, and I think it's called Traditions in Relationships, and it's the traditions applied to our work, our romantic, our familial relationships, the teams that we're in, the sports teams that we participate in. And it's applying the 12 steps. And what stands out for me on the most in that is our primary purpose. In everything that I do, if I hit a snag or I have an uncomfortable feeling, or if I start feeling guilty, or I intuit that this is not right, I ask myself, what is my primary purpose for being here? My primary purpose for being on this forum right now has been to carry the message, and I hope to some extent that I've said one sentence, one phrase that you can take away from me and find of use. It's been a privilege and an honor. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so great. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, strength, and hope. Your special story about your return to the morality of before your high school days, your religious and spiritual journey, your addict marriage and subsequent divorce, being a father, veering off the road, doing anything for a cup of cider. And, I see a refined businessman, that is reminding me that this disease knows no color, no social status. It can strike anyone, anywhere, irrespective of their social standing. Can you share a little bit about the moment where you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that you were desperate, that you needed to make a change? Can you share about your rock bottom that finally took you on the right path?
Hey Spearheads, if you're looking to dive deeper into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous with people who live the solution, then you won't want to miss Reco12 Big Book Roundtable. Join David G., Nikki M., and me, the moderator Justin B., 3 recovered addicts from multiple fellowships, as we break down the big book line by line. In each 30-minute episode, we share our experience, strength, and hope in a real, raw, and practical roundtable discussion. So, if you are ready to learn and apply what you learn, tune in to Reco12 Big Book Roundtable on your favorite podcast platform.
Yeah, sure. I beg your pardon. I'd be happy to. And I think for myself, I had rock bottoms on a number of levels. I had a few of them, and I think God looked after me in that sense, because if He'd hit me with all of them at the same time, I wouldn't be speaking to you here at this meeting. And the first rock bottom I had was the chaos, was a resentment and fear fueled a life of absolute chaos, of being a really nasty person to be around, being unhappy with myself, being unhappy and uncomfortable. In my brain, when I was a kid, I used to watch these black and whites with Charlie Chaplin and the Three Stooges and Laurel and Hardy, and every so often they do a drunk skit, and I look at them and I'd wonder what it was like to be in a parallel consciousness that made you stumble around and not be so aware. And that's what I think I drank for. But then I was drinking and taking drugs. For every cigarette I smoked a joint, and I'd do a good 20 or 30 cigarettes a day. I drank maintenance while I was at work, and then I'd do clubs, and at night I'd get 2 or 3 hours sleep. and it was a lifestyle that I was addicted to, and that was the first thing was the practical and physical the chaos, and I think at times I'd say, I'd be behaving that I'm behaving like an addict, and maybe I am an addict. I remember coming home from what was a happy hour at a hotel, and I'd left my car at work, and so I had to walk about 4 kilometers back at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was a long happy hour. And I passed this car pulled over along the side of the road, and it was a station wagon, and the guy had put the back seat down, and he was lying spread-eagled, and I looked at him and I thought, he's drunk, and I think if you stopped in this place on the road, you must be an alcoholic. That's typical alcoholic. And the irony of the situation, that it was the top deck of a double-decker highway. There was no pavement, and I'd taken it as a shortcut, and that for me was the insanity of step 3. There was that, and then there was my spiritual rock bottom when I did that page and a half, and what came out of that is that my beliefs haven't changed much in 28 years. I still believe in that simple entity because it is a keep it simple issue for me. I haven't clouded it with ideology and terms and concepts. It's me and my higher power and the world about me, and I keep it that simple. I was about 3 weeks into going to meetings, up to 8, 9 a week, and then I saw the triangle symbol at a top table in a meeting, and I learned then that the triangle meant service, recovery, and unity, and not matter, space, and time. And it is an ancient symbol, probably 2,000 or more years long, old, and meaning balance between life and your cognitive, emotive personality and your spirituality. It's not, incidentally, not copyrighted any longer by AA. The triangle symbol is free for all. And then there was, financial and divorce rock bottoms, which happened. My divorce happened a couple of, I think, 5 years, 2 or 3 years into my proper recovery. That was a rock bottom. I'm dual diagnosed with bipolar 2, ADHD, and PTSD, and my overcoming the denial of that only took place in recent times, and there was there was an emotional, psycho-emotional rock bottom, and at each after the initial realization 28 years ago, the 12 steps and my physical addiction, I was able to apply the 12 steps to all the successive ones. And I now have touchstones. I don't think twice. If a situation crops up that needs dealing with, I can find a step that explains why it came about, and I can find a step straight after that tells me how to fix it. And so, my first rock bottom equipped me to deal with all the successive ones. And that's pretty much that. I saw a question about my lifestyle steps. In terms of my lifestyle steps, I think I've just sort of touched on that. It's a lifestyle thing. It is a lifestyle thing. I apply the principles of the 12-step. My 12-step program is centered on the third step. It is the core. It is the secret of everything. So when I come up against a situation that I need to deal with, I apply the third step. I do use a third step prayer, and the amazing thing about that prayer is it says, I turn my will and my life over to you to build with and to do with. So we have an excuse in the third step prayer to turn our problems over to God, legitimately, to turn our problems over to God, for Him not to only attend to, but to build something out of it. And I think we need those building blocks in our life and in our lifestyle. And then it says, take away our problems. There's a legitimate reason to have our problems removed, so that we may be, but only on condition that we bear witness. In other words, sit in meetings like this and tell people, that we had this problem and God helped us sort it out and He built something out of it. And so every situation that comes up in my life that is stressing, problematic, morally querulous, I first of all apply the third step. I turn it over to God. I turn my children over to God. I turn my work relationships, my recovery relationships, my recreational associations, any situations that need guiding and prompting, I turn them over. And in that sense, I'm able to effectively do a mini step 4, 5, to identify what it is, the defect that needs attending. And I'll be honest, the defects that happened in my first step, a few of them, come up in my first round of steps. A few of them have come up in my successive proper rounds of steps. I've done the steps comprehensively and fully 4.5 times now, and each time my defect list gets shorter, and my and the hangovers on my amends list get shorter. But I now have the tools and the strategies to deal with something when it comes up and I can't live with it. So I've answered both those steps. I grow my conscious contact with God through the third step, and then just allowing it to happen. And I do my moral investigation and solution finding on the back of that third step. And I hope that answers your question. I had a sponsor in a town, a sponsee at least in a town, a bunch of probably about 100 kilometers away, an hour's drive away, and he came and he was rattling off a whole series of problems. He was facing challenges on a number of fronts, and he said he'd done everything. Now he was speaking to his sponsor, and sort of said that sort of petulantly. He'd done everything. He looked at the big book. He'd tried, he'd examined the 12 steps in terms of this whole situation. He asked me what to do, and I referred back to the real purpose, and I said, now go out and find an old lady and help her across the street. That's assuming she wants to go across the street, of course, but I think that's where you should be doing something like that. And there was a dead silence on the phone, and then the call ended. And then about 3 hours later, he called me back and he said, well, I just did what you said. And I went out and I couldn't find an old lady to help, but I did clear up all the litter on the sidewalks outside my house. And I went a couple of blocks doing that, and then I got back, and as soon as these issues started coming back at me, I'd given them time to breathe. I wasn't interfering. I wasn't trying to control. I hadn't caused a stress and a tension. I had given the situations time of their own and space and breathing space to resolve themselves. And I think that's one of the things I've learned, is that we can do our inventory. We have a strategy after that, but after that, we've got to turn it over to God, and we've got to go on and do other things, and we've got to put it on the back burner and allow things to happen for themselves. And I think a good part of my program has been learning to disengage and to detach and allowing things to happen. I hope that helps.
Hey, Reco12 Spearheads. If our recovery resources have helped you, please consider a donation. Your financial support, as well as your word-of-mouth support, keeps Reco12 running and reaching the man who is still sick. Donate today at reco12.com/support or check the show notes for PayPal and Venmo links. Every contribution helps carry the message. Thanks for being a Reco12 spearhead.
Thank you, Richard. That was totally amazing. Karen, are you on? That was so beautiful.
Yes.
So eloquent.
Go ahead, Brandy. Thank you.
I just wasn't sure if you were on. I was just saying thank you to Richard for his beautiful, eloquent, expressive share. So grateful to his recovery and just hearing about the transformation of his life and how he works his program every day in every way.
Yeah, and I love that you included that part about working with others. You know, that 2/3 of the people who recovered, our big book tells us, are those who went out and helped, like as you called it, the lady across the street, helped another person. And I know when I'm down, picking up the phone, sending a WhatsApp message, checking in on someone, is always an effective tool. Can you just, before we pray out, can you talk about how many people you work with at a time, how long you take to sponsor them, and a little bit more of a technical question?
Yeah, that's really horses for courses a situation, because I think there are as many ways of doing this as there are people doing it. There's many recovery plans as there are people in recovery, and so I have no right to interfere with somebody's journey in that respect. As somebody once said to me, you need to be careful what you say, because you might be the only big book somebody ever reads. And so I also know that I can't take on too many people at a time, and I need to be practical. I need to know how much time I can allocate this. I need to know how much work a person is going to entail. Some people require a lot more time than others. My particular take is that I'm not a counselor. I do the steps. I'm that kind of sponsor. I'm not that keen to take on problems. Having said that, I am a counselor in other areas, and so counselling has its place. I'm happy to do with it. I get a great deal of growth out of helping people in a counselling situation. But from a sponsoring and recovery point of view, I focus mainly on the recovery, on the 12-step program. I've worked for up to probably 4 or 5 people at a time, but I'm loath to take on any more people than that, because I need to rein my ego in. I'm not God's answer to the mass, to the multitudes. And these days, I can take we can probably go through the steps in about 8 to 10 weeks, bearing in mind that in the first days when AA was gaining momentum, they were popping off 12 steps in 2 weeks. The men's included. You've got to remember, in the 4th step at the end of the chapter, it says, having digested some huge chunks of truth about ourselves, and it doesn't say checked out everything in my inventory. And so the first time around, it's very much you write and write and write. You sit down, you write. I tell people, they should maybe make a ritual out of it, light a candle, get some meditation going, and then write your 4th step and write it until you can't write anymore, and then it's done. And we don't keep going back to it and adding stuff to it, because that's just a delaying tactic. And so when I do when I do the 12-step and I do help people in recovery, it's very much a prosaic attitude of we do what we can because we can't stop the process. We can't hinder the process. And the question is always, how quickly do you want to get better? So I'm not by any means saying that we should rush through it and do a slapdash job. What I am saying is that it isn't that complicated, and if we're trying to make things complicated, there's a good chance that if we introspect it's a delaying tactic and a diversion. But I think the flip side of that is that you can also do work in groups. You can organize conferences. You can organize roundups. You can speak in situations like this. And so, to quantify how many people one can help at a time, I've left that job to God. And God knows when there's a risk that I'm going to become complacent, then he throws in service opportunities like this, just to remind me of what it used to be like. And it's just part of the miracle.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Richard. And what I'm hearing and what you said is that, we're going to stay humble. We're going to be realistic. We want to help everybody and think sometimes we can help everybody in our addict brain. We get realistic about what we could do and what works and how we could be helpful to others, as our big book says. What I'm hearing is that you said there's no one right way. There are many fellowships. We have the monopoly. The big book says, if what you're doing is working for you, keep doing it. The first time I went to big book with a sponsor and lots of questions, the fellowship I'm in now, we use a workbook called and I love it. It's next level. I added to relapse between sessions. Yeah. So I'm hearing what you said is that we keep doing sure and we look out for how we can be humble. You said that also about the guy with the problem. He couldn't do another act, but he was able to clean up the litter, right? Your mom, like birth line, there's always another load of laundry to pin. There's always an easy meal to cook for your kids and your family to make the home more homey. There's always a coworker who might look like a bad day. Or what about this, a candy bar was desk in the office when they helped you. There's always somewhere where we could be of service, help another addict, help another human being. With that, I want to thank you so much, Richard. Your share is beautiful. Your whole demeanor is a man who is one of physical, spiritual, and mental recovery. And if you're like me on this line, that's something we're all praying for and hopefully working at one day at a time. Richard, I'd like to thank you, and I'm going to ask you to please pray us out.
Okay. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for listening. It is an honor and a privilege to be heard. I'm going to do I'm going to keep it simple. I'm just going to do the Serenity Prayer. That's the step 1 and 2 prayer. And let's have a moment of silence for the people that are, that will hear this meeting and the people that couldn't. The prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. Have a beautiful day, everybody.